Good morning. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen campus in Hong Kong. Welcome to the China on the Move series. We're sharing today's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the University of Chicago Yuen campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit the Yuen campus website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest news and information. Or you can also follow the UChicago Yuen campus Hong Kong social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and our new channel on LinkedIn. We'll wrap up tonight's program with a poll and more information about upcoming events you may be interested in, so please be sure to stay tuned until the very end. Tonight, we'll continue the Yuen campus series China on the Move with a new mini-series on the Greater Bay Area. We'll introduce the Greater Bay Area by sharing a big picture view on the GBA and discuss specific policies and practices in real terms and the future of the GBA as we emerge from COVID. We'll learn more about China's objectives for establishing an integrated megacity and the implications and opportunities for over 86 million people. We'll also explore the benefits of the GBA master plan for cities, companies, and individuals in the region. Today, we'll hear more about the economic dynamics of the GBA from our speakers. Professor Pomerantz is a distinguished university professor of modern Chinese history and in the college. Professor Pomerantz's work focused mostly on China, and he's also very interested in comparative and world history. Most of his research is on social, economic, and environmental history. But he's also worked on state formation, imperialism, religion, gender, and many other topics. Thanks for joining us from Chicago, Ken. I'll hand the stage over to you so that you can start the conversation with our guest experts.
Thanks very much, Mark. Welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here for the beginning of this series. The Greater Bay Area, as Mark said, has 86 million people. To put it in an American perspective, it's the geographic size of New Jersey, but it has more than twice the population of California, and it has roughly the GDP of metropolitan New York. We have three really interesting speakers tonight who will talk about the GBA from different but complementary points of view. We will start with John D. Wong, who is an associate professor at the University of Hong Kong, a graduate of the University of Chicago and of Harvard, and has worked outside of academia as a financial analyst. His research focuses on the flow of goods, capital, people, and ideas, and he has a particular interest in Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta area, and exploring how such flows have connected the region both to the Chinese political center in the north and to Hong Kong and the Bay Area's maritime partners in the South China Sea and beyond. His first book, Global Trade in the 19th Century, The House of Haokua and the Canton System, Cambridge University Press 2016, demonstrates how Chinese trading firms sustained their economic exchange on a global scale long before Western imperialism ushered in the era of globalization that created a European-centered modern world. In his forthcoming book, Hong Kong Takes Flight, coming this year from Harvard University Press, John explores the development of the airline industry in Hong Kong after the Second World War. His other publications have appeared in both area studies journals and business history journals, and he joins the editorial board of Business History this year. After John, we'll hear from Alain Bertaud, who is a senior fellow at NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management. He previously held the position of principal urban planner at the World Bank, and after leaving the bank in 1999, he worked as an independent consultant. Prior to joining the World Bank, he had worked as a resident urban planner in various cities around the world, including Bangkok, San Salvador, Port-au-Prince, Sana'a in Yemen, New York, Paris, Clemen in Algeria, and Chandigarh, India. Bertaud's research, conducted in collaboration with his wife, Marie Agnes, aims to bridge the gap between operational urban planning and urban economics. In his book, Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities, MIT Press 2018, he argues that cities are, above all, labor markets that attract investment and immigrants because of the attractions of the people who are already living in them. People and firms, through markets, create a spontaneous order. Infrastructure is then created by top-down design to serve this spontaneous order, rather than the infrastructure being the main shaping force of a city's economy, as some people often claim. Finally, last but by no means least, we will hear from Zhiguo, who is a professor at University of Chicago's Booth School of Business and director of the Becker-Friedman Institute's China program. He has also taught at Stanford and at Yale and holds degrees from Tsinghua University and from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Business, for which we forgive him. He is interested in the implications of agency frictions and debt maturities in financial markets and in macroeconomics, with a special focus on contract theory and banking. His recent research focuses on the role of financial institutions in the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, and he's currently conducting research on Chinese financial markets, including the stock market, local government debt, shadow banking, and interbank markets, together with recent regulatory changes. And if that wasn't enough, he also has an interest in cryptocurrency and blockchains. This research has won him multiple prizes and has been published in the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and other leading journals. He's been an associate editor for the Review of Financial Studies and Management Science, and currently serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Finance, and was guest editor of its special issue on China for 2020-2021. He's also worked in the private sector as a securities analyst, and he has testified before the US Congress on Chinese capital markets. So we have a very expert panel, lots and lots to say, and John, take it away.
Thank you, Professor Pomerantz. In the next few minutes, I would like to share with you some of my views, in particular, the historical context of the Greater Bay Area. And in talking about the Greater Bay Area, I would like to situate that in regional and global developments. And then after that, I will try to offer a little bit more of a close-up in one area in particular, Hong Kong, and try to explore how Hong Kong figures into this new configuration that has been recently introduced. To start off, I think we need to remind ourselves that the Greater Bay Area, or before it was called Greater Bay Area, the Pearl River Delta area, has been an important interface of China with the rest of the world. It's been quite a hub that facilitated the flow of people, goods, ideas, capital. And equally importantly, it has offered somewhat of a mechanism by which the political center in China has taken advantage of economic exchange with the rest of the world, while at the same time maintaining some sort of control of what happened on Chinese turf. So as I said before, it was called the Greater Bay Area, it was the Pearl River Delta area. And it's been an interesting site because there have been multiple jurisdictions throughout this area, throughout its long history. And because of that, enterprising international traders could avail themselves of different rules, different jurisdictions, and facilitated connections in a transnational and transcultural manner, all in this region. Now, one can go much farther back, farther back in time to the Tang Dynasty to think about this area. I'm not going to go that far. I'm just going to focus, go as far back as the 18th century. So in 1757, Canton officially became the sole port of call for Western traders dealing with China. And Macau, right down the stream from it, was a foreign enclave. And it was possible because of the topographical advantage that the area offered. In particular, you have the stranglehold called Boca Tigris, basically the area which allowed the Qing court to facilitate the flow of traffic into this region. And to be specific, is because of the type of transportation that was available at that time. And I will hesitate to follow the usual convention and call the Macau a Portuguese colony and to think of Portuguese as the only visitors at that location. In my own work, I've discovered that by the 1800s, it was certainly more than just the Portuguese. And if you were to go to Macau, you see the British dominance of that region, back even by 1800. All you need to do is to go to the site of the headquarters of what used to be the East India Company and see how imposing that is compared to even the government house where the governor lived. So there's a Portuguese seat of power, but it's quite an international site by the early part of the 19th century. Now that's period one. That's the period of the Canton trade, China trade that was facilitated in Canton. It got all changed by the 1840s. The British took over Hong Kong and officially made it a colony in 1842. And we have to think about that. Basically Hong Kong was usurping the role of Canton by that time, but it was not just Hong Kong. Hong Kong was indeed special because it was a colony. But then in the context of that era, you have many treaty ports as well. And Hong Kong's primacy actually came much later. You have foreign presence in China that's spread well beyond the Pearl River Delta area. All these treaty ports were located primarily on the coast or later on along the riverways. If you don't believe me, all you need to do is to go to Shanghai and visit the Bund. All the majestic buildings that are still there would actually put Hong Kong to shame. They are a lot more ornate than anything that is still around in Hong Kong or in old Hong Kong pictures, both in scale and scope. That's not to mention the French concession area and the American sphere of influence. That changed again by the 1940s, primarily because of the nationalist Chinese government's participation in World War II. Foreign powers started to give up or to lose the privileges in the treaty ports, and Hong Kong became very special, especially in the aftermath of World War II, because it became the only Westerners' foothold in that part of the world. So what type of transformation have we seen? We have a Pearl River Delta area that was centered on Canton and Macau, yielding to a configuration that was Hong Kong, Shanghai, and many other treaty ports. And by the conclusion of the Second World War, Hong Kong. Now, the next stage of development was, of course, 1949, when the communists took over the mainland. But just as importantly, you have the CCP's or China's entry into the Korean War that brought about the 1951 embargo. That basically shut Communist China out of half the world. And it was more of the US-led efforts to blockade the PRC economically and financially that made Hong Kong even more special. So Hong Kong became an outlet for the PRC. And the US made an exception for Hong Kong in the embargo provision. So you have Hong Kong entrepreneurs circumventing some of the provisions of the UN/US embargo. But let's not give credit all to the US or the UN, because there was also the development of Hong Kong because of the CCP's intentions. We don't need to remind ourselves too much of the saying that we hear a lot, 长期打算，充分利用, so long-term planning and full utilization of Hong Kong. So rather than viewing Hong Kong as purely for its importance as a colonial status, as pure British triumph, it was an arrangement that was convenient and appropriate for all sides concerned, not just the British, but also the US and the PRC. And that was a golden era of Hong Kong, especially from the late 1960s through the 1980s, because it was a stranglehold of Sino-Western exchange. So what have we moved from to this stage? You have the first period of the Canton trade, and then Hong Kong and the treaty ports, and then post-World War II Hong Kong. The next seismic shift happened, of course, by the late 1970s. That's the opening of China again, the reform era. 1979, you have the establishment of special economic zones. Important to Hong Kong were Shenzhen and Zhuhai. Of course, there were the ones like Xiamen and Shantou. And we can think of these special economic zones as somewhat like a reverse treaty port arrangement. There was control on where exchange could take place in China, so somewhat reminiscent of the Canton period. And more importantly, the terms of exchange. The CCP basically reversed the trend of Western dominance of international routes of commerce since the Opium War. Now, that was both a threat to Hong Kong because it was not the only place anymore where you could conduct China trade, but it's also an opportunity. So many Hong Kong businesses moved north, and Guangdong became quite a manufacturing site of Hong Kong, especially in places like Dongguan. What took many by surprise, though, was the development of Shenzhen, which many in Hong Kong consider to be backwater, economic, cultural, and everything. Explosive growth there. You have Huawei, you have Tencent. Throughout the period that witnessed many other important developments like the handover of Hong Kong 1997 and then Macau 1999. So what now? You have the rebranding of the Pearl River Delta area into the Greater Bay Area. Many in Hong Kong see that as a top-down imposition of this new rule of the game, a new order. But if we were to just trace its development, you can see that it's long in the making. There's a long tradition that started centuries ago. And it's more of a shift in the relative power across the various jurisdictions. And the rise of Shenzhen, is surprising and somewhat uncomfortable for Hong Kong, because guess who's a poor cousin now? So the way it's conceived is, finance in Hong Kong, science in Shenzhen, logistics in Zhuhai. But I think what we seem to be getting into trouble is that you cannot take individuals as fungible entities that you can just move across space. And that's where the trouble is for many in Hong Kong. So what about Hong Kong? Is all lost? Well, not quite. I think if we were to not focus on specific political considerations and instead look at the business and economic infrastructure that the current arrangement facilitates, maybe we can get some inspiration. After all, foreigners didn't invest in Hong Kong or work through Hong Kong in the 1970s because the city had the perfect political arrangement of democracy, far from it. But what's left in Hong Kong right now? I mean, many would point to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and then say, but then you have one in Shanghai and another one in Shenzhen that seem to be equally good. I think that's important for us to note, but just as important is for us to look at the components of the Hang Seng Index. How many of the top 10 of those components derive profits primarily in Hong Kong? Actually, one, HSBC. So for any financial center, the catchment area is important, and it extends well beyond the city. New York is a financial center in the US, not just because what happened in New York City, New York State, but throughout the US and beyond. Same with London, and same has happened to Hong Kong as well. But beyond that, I would also like to remind everyone that it's not just a stock market that's important. Think Hong Kong dollar, look in your wallet. That's the only city, only place under the rule of the CCP where the renminbi, the RMB is not legal tender. As a matter of fact, the money in our wallet might as well be US dollar because the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. And it's worth a lot because the RMB is not quite ready for prime time yet as a free floating international currency, and Hong Kong still has its role to play, especially through this linkage of the Hong Kong dollar. For anything else, well, we love to talk about logistics, but we have Shunfeng in Shenzhen that seems to do better with logistics than many of the companies I see in Hong Kong, and mainland apps in that regard seem to be more effective than what I use in Hong Kong as well. Well, I happen to be working on a current project on aviation, and from that, I think we can also draw some inspiration. Those of us who travel to China, we don't need to be reminded that Beijing and Shanghai, they have nice airports, more spectacular airports than what we have, somewhat of a new airport in Hong Kong, started in 1998, but it's quickly getting outpaced. But these airports, these airways function under different systems. I don't need to explain to anyone who has flown into China or Hong Kong to know that there's a difference. Flights into China, there might be more delays, primarily because of air traffic control. Things seem to be more predictable in Hong Kong, at least before COVID. So apparently landings and takeoffs are not quite at the mercy of the control of airspace as they might be in the mainland. So hopefully for Hong Kong, in that regard, there's a role for Hong Kong to play in logistics in a post-COVID era. Well, just to sum up, I would say that to understand the coordination of the various activities in the Greater Bay Area and each participant's role thereof, we need to have more of a historically informed, spatially flexible, and culturally sensible understanding of this region. And I look forward to exchange with our other panelists and with the audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John, for getting us started. Now we will go from the historian to the planner. Alain, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to use slides. I am an urban planner by or an urbanist by training, and I like to have I often need props. Here we are. So I'm going to talk first about cities as labor market. You know, the Greater Bay Area is before a large labor market, and so I will briefly remind people of the importance of large labor market and also their limitation. You know, could they grow ad infinitum, or are they limited physically? Then I will remind people that the Greater Bay Area in this year, 2022, is potentially the largest urban labor market in the world, but by far. And finally, this very large labor market is only potential. It's depend largely on the transport system, which will allow to connect everybody in this large labor market. And again, there is no precedent. You know, there is no precedent in size by far of this, and I will try to show that. So the main challenge to really, to get the potential, the economic potential of a very large labor market will depend on the progress in transport. And again, there is no precedent. It's not a question of expanding a subway system or a rapid rail system or a bus system or any sort of transit. It's something much more complex than that, which there is no precedent. The scale is important. You know, so let us move now to why large labor markets are more productive than smaller one. You know, it seems a bit counterintuitive. After all, everybody who has been to Bangkok or Jakarta, which are very large labor market, feel that congestion is an enormous tax on the productivity of those cities. Well, in spite of that, all over the world, we find that when you have a large agglomeration of labor in a small area, those people are more productive and more innovative than in smaller cities. And in spite of, again, the enormous challenge posed by running a very large city, and especially in transport and infrastructure. So in fact, many large labor markets, for instance, if we take New York metropolitan area, are fragmented because the transport system is not really, do not allow you, if you live in New Jersey, for instance, to work in Long Island, really. I mean, some people might do it, but not really. If you have a commuting time of more than 1 hour, usually, that's where the labor market fragment. So the challenge really to recover, to exploit to the maximum the potential productivity of large labor market is to develop a transport system which will allow in any large labor market to go from one area to another in less than 1 hour. And this has not happened yet. It needs to be invented. So I will just remind you of the way those transport systems work. I have here 4 graphs. So the one on the left, the monocentric model, is a classical model where most jobs are and amenities are concentrated in the center, and people commute from the suburbs to the center and back, like a tide every morning, like that. This model, in fact, do not really exist anymore in very large city. It exists in cities, let's say, around 1 million people or below. Then there is this other model, which is more recent and appear first in North America, which I call the dispersed model. Will be, for instance, an example would be Atlanta or Los Angeles, where jobs are practically dispersed all around the urban area. And so you have transport which have commuting trips, which are dispersed origin and dispersed destination. And those model works relatively well. I mean, cities like Atlanta, Los Angeles, or Houston are very prosperous, but they rely entirely on practically on individual cars. There is no way to accommodate a transit system in area like that. So they have to be relatively low density to echo that. The most common model is the one in the middle of my graph here that I call the composite model. It's in fact the superimposition of the two former model, where you have a center still with a lot of amenities and jobs, but mostly amenities. And then you have also a lot of jobs which are in the suburbs, and most of the trips, in fact, are from suburbs to suburbs. This is the case in Paris or New York. In those two models which follow the composite model, 70% of the trips are in fact from suburbs to suburbs, and this is quite a challenge. Then finally, on the right here, I have what the Chinese, I think, were the first to call urban clusters, and became a policy in China some 20 years ago, if I remember well. And these are not sub-centers, but individual cities which are linked together and close enough so that it's possible to commute from one to another. And this becomes, of course, extremely complex in terms of transport and running a city like that. There's some precedent in Europe, but they are not really at the size as we will see. They are nearly an order of magnitude smaller than what we are talking about when we talk about the Greater Bay Area. So the Greater Bay Area is potentially the largest urban labor market in the world, but by far. And the scale itself creates a challenge. Again, there is no precedent. We have to invent something new to make it work. The theoretical model tells us that if we could manage to integrate this labor market of 85 million people into one labor market, that means that you could go from any part of Hong Kong to any part of Guangzhou area, or Fushan, that will create an enormous productivity with no precedent in the world. So the scale is extraordinary for me as a European, when I realized that the Greater Bay Area has a population which is slightly larger than Germany, and that in a, let's say, inscribed in a square of about 120 kilometers by 120 kilometers. So this is an enormous thing. If we compare to Tokyo, Bay Area, New York, or San Francisco, we see that we are talking about a very different animal, in terms of labor market. So here I compare a map. On the top here, I have the Greater Bay Area with the built-up area represented in red, and below I compare two cities, two very large cities, but which are still on the composite model, which are not really cluster cities. Below is Seoul, and the other is Paris. So Seoul there has 25 million people, and Paris 12 million people. You see that you have in those cities, you have a core, and then you have suburbs, and you have a lot, most of the jobs are in the suburbs now, let's face it, but you have a core and suburbs. So you have a very different structure from the Bay Area, from the Greater Bay Area, where you have really completely individual cities, which are independent, and especially with completely different, in a way, management, especially if we think of Hong Kong and Macau and the rest of the Bay. So here, a precedent for a cluster in Europe, which is always quoted, is Randstad area. Randstad is in Holland. It's the conurbation formed by Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. But again, here we are talking about 8.4 million people. By the way, all my maps are represented exactly at the same scale. So you see here the Bay on the left, the Greater Bay Area on the left, and the Randstad on the right. Again, here we are talking, if we are talking about transport, there is nothing to be learned from the Randstad. We are talking about a different animal. Here is San Francisco Bay, again, represented at the same scale as the Greater Bay Area. And again, we are, for San Francisco Bay, we are talking about, basically 10 million people, which is, a very small area compared to the Greater Bay Area. One, there is a way of, there are many ways of measuring, of course, the success of this and the integration of this bay. One of them is to look at the super tall building in the urban area, a building which are more than 300 meters and taller. And you see that in the Pearl River Delta, the Greater Bay Area, this dwarfs again all the other type of urbanization. Now, it's a small indicators. I am not, maybe as an architect, I like it as an indicator. It might be other indicators who are more important. But what is interesting too is that if you look at the way the super tall buildings are spread, they are not concentrated only in one city, but they are spread not really equally between Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. And that's again what differentiates it from a city like New York, for instance, or things like that. So transport innovation is what is really needed for integrate the labor market. So I will, they have made already a lot of progress. Clearly, the government of China is really keen in investing in transport. And I have here two maps which were extracted from a report by Gary Smith, who did it for Bering, and I have the reference here. It's an extremely interesting report. It shows on 8 years the difference of accessibility from Hong Kong to the rest of the Bay. And this is only, of course, a small part of the integration of labor market, because we are talking really about station to station, railway station to railway station. So we need to integrate it more. So the problem will be, the challenge will be really to expand it. And I think that it will be done not only by having very fast train from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Shenzhen to Foshan or wherever in the Bay, but you need to combine within the same trip several modes of transport. And here I had an inspiration in Beijing when going to the far end of the metro station in Beijing, I found that there was a network of this little thing that shown on the right here, which were a motorcycle. This was, by the way, they were illegal, but they were functioning, and they were giving access from the large metro station to the houses of people or to commerce. And I think that there are many new things which like the picture on the left here is a Toyota. It's called Toyota E-Road. It's something that you can get by just putting your credit card in there. So this will be the challenge. Again, I don't know what this transport system will be, but if it can be done, then certainly the productivity and creativity of this area will be, unprecedented. And so this is in my book. I develop a little more the idea of labor market and transport system. And so thank you very much. This is.
Great. Thank you, Alain. And now we will go to Zhiguo, who will talk about a very different kind of flow, that of capital.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me on talking about the Greater Bay Area, and great presentation to the previous two. In some senses, that's one is history, the other side is obviously unreal, and we do think that China is a super. I mean, history proved it is that they're pretty good at making the infrastructure investment. So I would not worry too much about whether they are able to do the good job on that. Well, something that I think that the Chinese government have been trying a lot although that we see progress, but often the time we see setbacks is on this financial reform. Financial reform, including all these markets, various kind of things, where let the market really to express itself, let the market to be decisive, right? So I want to go back to the John's kind of a question, which is that whether the Hong Kong will be replaced by Shenzhen. And my answer is always no. I will tell every student taking my MBA class, no. So this go back to there's a much bigger picture here is about how does the China getting to the ultimate goal like the US, where you want your currency to be something that everybody is happy to use. That is something so hard, so that one important step is so-called capital. Relax. You have to relax the capital control. So let me just make 2 points surround this core issue. The Greater Bay Area is such a great thing for Beijing to experiment on the relaxing the capital control. Okay. We know this is just if you can't move your money around, or if you cannot immediately convert in a very reasonable speed or convenience, and convert your RMB back to anything you want, then nobody wants to hold it. It's just as a plain fact. This is a market force. You cannot deny it. Interestingly, the technology really help. So I will just mention several cases. One is something called a Connect. Most of the people who are in this audience, if it's just Hugang Tong, these Tong, okay, you must immediately see that that's such a big innovation, needs a lot of technology behind it, but conceptually it's very simple. It's just that making sure that it's a closed loop. So whenever you want to get out, it's just within a, think about it. I always take the analogy is that you take a group of people, go to outside, let's say United States to travel, and making sure they're not getting out of this park or zoo, so that when you want them to get back, they can get back. Now it's limited, limited integration, obviously, or a capital flow, but it does have a lot of a good side of it. It means that if you worry about a capital outflow, like unorderly capital outflow, which hurts Argentina, hurts all these developing countries, this way of controlled openness is the way to go. It's slowly and make it happen. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second one is that you must have heard about this Wealth Management Connect, and recently that China, this ECNY development, and then also try to connect to the Hong Kong's what's it called, faster payment system. All these type of things, just again that confirm or support my perspective is that if you do have another level of technology, let's say people would worry about these once you have ECNY, it's essentially there's a very interesting way to making sure that you can trace through the money flow payments. Now, what's important that why the CBDC or ECNY is different from other kinds of a payment is that there will be a central bank, at least that's the Chinese version, central bank are able to trace through from all these encrypted sequence to the real identity. But whoever is participating in it, they just see very random nodes, random numbers, random streams. So they cannot get the information. So those are the so-called managed anonymity, and those are very important concept in the payment. It's just to satisfy the compliance, but also remain privacy. So those type of issues are, this is the good side of the technology. And I do believe that once you have these type of technology, then will open the door of another level of capital, relaxing the capital control. And you see many progress are making. I hope they're going to be faster, but I feel like this is Beijing's progress anyway. Just every single step of doing some experiment or the things. You can imagine that later on with this M-Bridge CBDC experiment, then all the different parts, at least the Bank of Thailand or some other, it's the UAE central bank are able to do those trader finance and the supply chain finance all together using the newly developed ECNY. That will really help the capital control to get it to the next stage, so that at least that this is set the stage for even further reform and openness. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Those were three really interesting presentations. And now I think we'll go to questions. And we have a number of questions from the audience that are on more or less the same theme. And that's the legal system. So we've talked about integrating the Greater Bay Area in various ways. One way in which it is not currently integrated is that it has multiple legal systems. So I guess I'd like to ask the panelists to what extent they see that as an obstacle, to what extent they see that as maybe even an asset or at least not a problem, and where they see things going over time. Anybody want to start?
I can offer my view on this. I do see it as an asset, not a liability. We tend to think that it's easier to do business if the legal system is homogenized, is harmonized. But the beauty of the Greater Bay Area, at least in a historical context, is precisely the multiple jurisdictions that one could work within. So there's this thing that's called forum shopping. So you can take your case from one jurisdiction to another and see if you can further your interests that way. And that has been something that enterprising business people seem to have enjoyed. And actually, you don't even need to think about business people, but in terms of your status as a resident in place A versus place B, there is something to be said about being in a different jurisdiction that would help you make a better living. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily an obstacle. In certain cases, it would be. If things come into conflict and then you need to adjudicate between two different jurisdictions, that would be more of an issue for Beijing and how they would allow more of a hands-off approach. I think that's something that we shall see. But I think that at least from a historical perspective, that's more of an asset than a liability.
I would add that at least this is the huge asset for Hong Kong, I think, from the financial perspective, financial market perspective. You have to understand that this security law, if it's under common law, it's very different from the security law under the civil law. And most of the most developed financial institutions who has the biggest financial resources that Chinese, Beijing would like to attract. Those are like long-term investors like pension funds, endowment fund. Those are great, best investors on the world. They want the security laws under the common law. So in that sense, this is exactly why that I tell my MBA students, it's just those type of issues that give even if you're giving 50 years to another 50 or 70 years to Beijing, China, I don't know where does it go, because there's some natural limit on those issues. But Hong Kong, it's there, and if you just keep the economic side, just keep the financial market side, it's okay, it's fine. We all do business, and this is the rules that they're setting up. That's it. So in that sense, that I do think that I would give the asset side to the Hong Kong, and that's great.
Okay, We've got another cluster of questions, I would say, that have to deal with other comparisons beyond the ones that the panelists have already made. And one that people seem to be interested in is other possible clusters within China. So the Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei cluster, Greater Shanghai. Do any of these offer either important competitors for the Greater Bay Area or interesting models of things to either do or avoid?
Well, I think that if you look at the actual size of the population and the linkage of the population, the Greater Bay Area is by far more advanced than all the other clusters in China. Let's say the largest one would be the Shanghai, and the other, the Jinjinji. But the Jinjinji really now effectively is really Beijing, Tianjin. It's not the rest is plan. It's a goal of integration. It's not really there. So I think that again, in the same way as when we were comparing to the great, to the San Francisco Bay or Holland, these are again we have an order of magnitude already ahead of the other clusters.
Just to add one point that I do think that the specialty of GBA is just because of these the issues that we were mentioned, jurisdiction, currency. That's exactly what China would like to experiment. While other like Shanghai is slightly different. Shanghai is also try to explore these type of issues on this trade versus the financial market part. But Jinjinji is totally different animal. I'm not expert on those things, so that's why I feel like it just that GBA has much more to look.
I agree. I think it's again back to the different jurisdictions. If you have a couple of special administrative zones, a couple of special economic zones, and an area that is the hinterlands that would feed into the system, it is a different proposition compared to many of the other areas that we can compare the GBA to in the rest of China, and that's precisely the selling point of the GBA, at least at the moment.
Okay. We've got another question that I guess is in some ways a COVID or post-COVID question, which is given the increased adoption of remote working, does this change any of the ways of thinking about how an urban cluster would work, and maybe particularly the priority of transportation as opposed to IT infrastructure or institutional integration?
I think it facilitates this large collaboration in a certain way. You still have an enormous amount of freight, which is not, of course, cannot be done remotely by definition. And people, by the way, underestimate the freight which is necessary to maintain this very large thing. So here, the freight is not affected by the COVID at all. If people go to work remotely 3 days a week, this will facilitate the transport across the zone. So I don't see any an impediment for that. I don't think it will change. I think it will facilitate slightly the integration of the labor market.
I honestly hope that in the next 4 or 3 years, at least at the horizon of this GBA, that we do not need to think about a COVID anymore. And by the way, that I do feel like I think a lot of people agree with me. The within the city transportation in Hong Kong is super good. I don't know why, and I'm not expert on that. And I feel like Shenzhen is okay. Shanghai is not that good. Beijing is the worst. So there must be something, and I enjoy being in Hong Kong in the sense I can talk to people in different buildings that are in a very efficient way, much better than Beijing.
I agree that we need to separate the discussion of freight versus people, or from people. Freight, I think has been relatively seamless during COVID because it's easier to sanitize freight goods versus people. But COVID has not just introduced this more intense idea of work from home. COVID has also intensified the separation of people across borders. So if we were to think about it, within each city, I agree with Zhiguo. Hong Kong's transportation system is basically second to none wherever I travel. But then if you think about the jurisdictional boundaries again, I mean, that was an asset in the previous discussion, it's become a huge liability when you cannot even cross a bridge to go to Macau or to go across the border to Shenzhen. And I think that is unfortunately quite possibly a legacy that we need to contend with. I do agree with Zhiguo. Let's hope that if, in the next few years, we don't need to worry about COVID. But I think some of the lingering issues in terms of the transformation of border control because of this pandemic mindset may be with us for a little while.
The question of borders actually feeds nicely into one of the other questions we have here, which is about the hukou system. And I mean, suppose we could broaden it more generally to restrictions on people moving their residence. Is it necessary to change that for the health of the Greater Bay Area? If so, what kind of changes are needed? If not, why not?
Anyone would, I'm not an expert on that, but for someone who live in China for more than 24, I moved to, I came here to study when I was 24. And at that time that, hukou is not something, is something important for ordinary people, I would say. And then, but if you are able to get a high degree, then it's not a constraint at all. And I feel like in the past 20 years when I left the country and now, the constraint even imposed on these high educated people, that's the real right, bottleneck or constraint or efficiency caused. If we believe that, Alain presented such a great work on showing that all these people, but you need to making sure that the people to move to the best place or best people move to the best place. Otherwise, it's just useless. So in that sense that I do think that, it's a great question. I would guess that like Shenzhen has a much better, it's a very, very good policies on those issues. And obviously there's some capacity problem. Shenzhen does not have the best university yet. That's something that I believe that the Shenzhen government are working very hard. All the things I do think that as long as within the China part, I feel like they can do something about it. It's the cross probably has more issues. For instance, I don't think they can easily go to Hong Kong. That's a just totally different question then all of a sudden.
Yeah, I don't study the hukou system and I don't profess to have the latest data on that. But I think to explore whether the hukou system needs to stay depends on the perspective. If you're looking at it from the perspective of Beijing, well, maybe certain of these barriers are not welcome. In particular, if someone moves from another part of China to Hong Kong, they lose they shed the hukou in the mainland, takes on a Hong Kong permanent resident status. That confers on them certain protection, I believe, of their assets in a way that they may not enjoy in mainland China. And that's precisely why you have the influx of capital in Hong Kong, especially in the real estate market and other forms of investment, as far as I understand, if that's still the latest thinking. So from Beijing's perspective, that could well be something that they would like to rectify. And that's something that actually could well have ignited what we saw in 2019 in terms of the anti-extradition bill, because if you have a hukou in Hong Kong, I cannot touch you. That's not something that Beijing is comfortable with. On the other hand, there's also something about the hukou system that may sit well with certain residents in the Greater Bay Area. In particular, the 150 who can move to Hong Kong from China creates more of a steep gradient of the movement of people into certain jurisdictions, in this case, Hong Kong. So I would imagine within the Greater Bay Area, certain residents would not welcome a simplification of the hukou registration.
But you know, there is an element which maybe is worse than the hukou in preventing, let's say, the distribution of people in the right area. It's affordability of housing. And I think this is something that it's equivalent of a hukou in a certain way. You know, in the United States, it's clear. You know, there have been some interesting studies about the loss of GDP because of the completely screwed up system of housing in New York and San Francisco, and it's equivalent of a hukou, really. So that will have to be addressed too.
Okay, the next question we've got, I think, was probably intended for John, so I'll start it with him, but obviously everybody should feel free to comment. And the person says that what we have at the moment sounds like one area, three systems. Can we learn anything from the days of the Canton system to help devise mechanisms to overcome and address the kinds of challenges that creates?
Well, I'm not sure what particular issues we are trying to address if we were to transform the system. What I find problematic in the current arrangement is that, especially on last slides, we alerted to the scale, the scope of this area, and in particular the density of certain urban areas. What seems to be the issue, at least from the vantage point of Hong Kong, is not the hard infrastructure. The developmental state seems to be very good at that. The linkages have been facilitated. What seems to be problematic is the creation of soft infrastructure that would fashion certain gradient from place to place. Aspirational gradients to move from place to place, or difficulty, in terms of barriers to entry. And I think that's something that our master plan behind the Greater Bay Area does not seem to address. And that, I'm afraid is not something that the Canton experience can help us, because that was imposed on the various jurisdictions. Whereas the current situation is more of a master plan of Beijing that seems to be executed on multiple locales. So I think it's really Beijing's wisdom in this regard that would help us create the gradients necessary to channel energy in the right direction within this region.
Anyone else want to pick up on this, or shall we go to the next question? Okay, we've got a question that takes us in a very different direction, which is that the Greater Bay Area, at least outside of China, is not yet a household name in the way that, say, Silicon Valley is. And this raises the question of branding. How important is it to have people outside the Greater Bay Area think of it as the Greater Bay Area? And what kinds of steps would be useful in promoting that if it is important?
I can start.
Okay.
I mean, there's a Chinese name versus the English name.
Right.
And so Chinese name 大湾区, which I don't feel like it's connected to the Guigu, which is Silicon Valley. So I don't see why that people think that way. The second point is that it is a interesting question that why do they change to, like, was started at Alain was talking about it, like it's the Zhujiang Sanjiao, right? It's the Pearl River Delta, right? So I do not know why it's changing. So if the real question has to be then what is good about the latter name than the Zhujiang Sanjiao? That I didn't know. But in terms of this stealing the name, I don't get it, to be honest.
And no, I don't think the idea was stealing the name. I think it was just, that was a comparison, right? That's a name that,
Oh, okay.
that has stuck. And so
Okay.
far, at least Greater Bay Area,
Mhm.
I don't think has stuck.
So
was
so
thinking-
I do have a question. Maybe my panelists that have the answer. Why do they change it to the Greater Bay Area from the Delta thing?
To me, it's a big marketing move. It's a rebranding exercise that signals a certain level of coordination that the state can help you with, if you to be charitable with the whole initiative. But then again, I think what seems to be what we seem to find wanting is that you can rename it, you can rebrand it, but then the inherent logic needs to be there. So these Silicon Valley, the Bay Area in San Francisco, it works because you have Silicon Valley and then you have the financial sector that's in the city and Sand Hill Road. So what I find quite interesting, especially closer to home in the Greater Bay Area, is that if Shenzhen is going to be the Silicon Valley and Hong Kong is going to be San Francisco, the city, and also Sand Hill Road, I don't see a whole lot of cooperation that way. There is no Kleiner Perkins that is funding the next Facebook in the Greater Bay Area. Then you can see how that is going to stick and people can see the inherent logic behind it. At the moment, it seems to be more rhetoric and slogan. Maybe, what time will tell, maybe the orchestration will lead to some fruitful coordination and results.
Okay, this question was specifically addressed to Professor He, but again, others should feel free to chime in. Question asks you, could you elaborate on the point about how Hong Kong is irreplaceable as a financial city for China compared to, say, Shenzhen or Shanghai? How do you see the Hong Kong exchange attracting foreign capital in the medium to long term?
Yeah, it's about the law. It's about a law system. If you have those like a financial fraud, right, and then you need to sue, and then when you sue, who is whether the law system is independent of the exchange, let's say. At this point, that in China, it's very hard to have a fully independence, and it's just that. But the Hong Kong and the UK thing is more transparent, I have to say. Mm-hmm. So that's the issue.
And then maybe related to that, we have a question that asks, how should we think about the tax system or reform thereof and how it might facilitate the integration of the Greater Bay Area? Is that a priority? And if so, what are the things that really need to be addressed?
John, you're resident
smiling.
there.
I'm
You guys
smiling
should
because
be very
I don't know
happy
the
about it.
answer. I don't know the tax system on the mainland side. But then if we were to look at it from the Hong Kong side, I actually echo what Alain said earlier about hukou. Hong Kong taxes are supposedly very low, but not if you figure in the real estate tax that we pay in our rent or mortgage. So if you adjust for that, the tax regime in Hong Kong is not quite as reputably generous as has been advertised. And if that's the case, then Shenzhen is quickly catching up as well as are many places in the Greater Bay Area. So I guess I'm just dodging the question. To me, taxation, if you just look at how much you pay the IRS or inland revenue, is but a small part of your dues to the state. And in the case of Hong Kong, real estate is actually a more onerous burden, and the state stands to benefit quite a bit from that. So I defer to the rest of you on the case in China.
So in terms of the tax, I'm paying both sides. I have a little bit income in China, in US, it's the same tax rate. It's almost the same. Indiana, I'm just paying about 30 to 40% of my income. However, that that Shenzhen is if I'm going to move to Hong Kong, then I will be happy because Hong Kong is famous for low tax. But Shenzhen moved. It's just that if you are those qualified whatever have these credentials, then you're eligible to get as low as Hong Kong. Just in a way that I think to a higher level to answer your question, these are the necessary tools to manage the flow, the human capital flow, and I think Beijing is super good at it. So in that sense, that you should view those as a necessary tools to help with the transition into a smoother way for the better. Otherwise, just you get into a chaos. If a uniform tax rate is just get into a chaos, partly because that a lot of times that you have these disparities, not only on the tax system, but the education, medical, all these things, you need some other lever to adjust, and the tax is a very important part of it.
Okay, the next question takes us in a somewhat different direction, but an interesting one. And it asks if any of the panels would like to comment on grassroots enthusiasm or lack thereof for continued Greater Bay Area integration, right? There's a clear policy logic to integration, but as we know from many examples all over the world, those advantages are not always transparently obvious to ordinary people, particularly less prosperous ordinary people, who may feel the loss of particular advantages they have from the incompleteness of markets. And so the question asks, is, as the question puts it, the person on the street excited, wary, indifferent, or do we know?
Unfortunately, I don't have a first-hand experience on. I would imagine that the ordinary people in Dongguan probably don't feel that way. But the Shenzhen will have a strong feeling on that. It's also that I think that I like what John was talking about, the rebranding, or a lot of times that China always Beijing, like just the secret of success of Beijing is to try many different things. There's always some slogan. Mm-hmm. There's some great study nowadays just to try to figure out that how many of these kind of experiments actually failed, how many of them succeed. There are a bunch of them succeed, Shenzhen, a bunch of them failed, but you just didn't remember. But that's a great thing to experiment. So Greater Bay Area, I would, in my perspective, the biggest thing they're gonna, as I said, is the financial reform side. That it's a very impediment. It's like right now they have to address it if they indeed would like to get the financing or the flow, and also keep the Hong Kong as prosperous as possible. This is the necessary thing to do. So that's why that this is the slogan. Whether that how much is helping Dongguan or even inner land, I believe they are, and also helping the infrastructure building all the things. And if they indeed succeeded, they're going to bring it to other parts. But if it's a fails, fine. Nothing really hurts.
I think that there is a spontaneous aspect in those collaboration. Even in China, people believe that China, everything is kind of a plan much more than. I don't believe so. I think that success comes really from a spontaneous order. That people are attracted by people who are successful in a certain area, and I think, by the way, that also individual mayors and even within counties, there is a spirit of enterprise and understanding of market, which is, I think, sometimes better than it is in New Jersey or in New York, actually, strangely enough. So I think that this spontaneous order is also what, and again, when I say that to my American colleague, when I talk about China, they are kind of astonished because they feel that in China everything is still centrally planned, and it's absolutely not the case, I think.
Yes, it all depends on what constitutes grassroots. If what we're talking about is my students in the classroom, no, the idea is not welcome. People in their teenage years, they don't love that idea. But then we also need to remind ourselves that Greater Bay Area actually happened before there was a Greater Bay Area. People who are now in their 40s, 50s, 60s, a lot of them moved in the Greater Bay Area, either by resuscitating old contacts in the Guangdong area or refashioning new contacts and connections. And that's in spite of more insurmountable linguistic challenges. Many in that age group did not speak a word of Putonghua, and they had to learn it. And they were difficult to understand, and they had to communicate with people who might not even be Putonghua speakers. They did it. So before there was Greater Bay Area, there was a lot of connections between Hong Kong and the region already that were resuscitated beginning in the 70s and then all the way into the 90s. I think it's back to what I said about the gradient. Grassroots feel it differently or have felt it differently. When there was money to be made, many Hong Kongers put their resources in the Greater Bay Area, moved their factories in the Greater Bay Area. But then now, back to the question we had, what would then be the specific advantage of Hong Kong, and why would I still make a better living because of this concept versus before? So I think the younger generation seems to have more resistance because the proposition is not quite as apparent to them.
Yeah, I worked with the World Bank in Shenzhen in 1983, I think, if I remember well. And I can tell you that what happened between this time and now, there was a lot of, the infrastructure was top down, but the amount of people who will come to Shenzhen or to the Bay in general is also something spontaneous. Shenzhen was the first labor market, by the way. People forget that. It was the first labor market, and the attraction was China-wide. People were confident that if they were rewarded for their merit, they would be better off than if they stay in their town. So that was spontaneous.
Lots of people resigned from government posts, and they became rich.
Those were also
During
the
that
days
time.
when the median age of the Shenzhen population was something like 25. It would be really interesting to trace some of those people now that they're 50 something and get their perspective on some of these things. We've got a question. We've talked a lot about Hong Kong for obvious reasons. And we have a question that asks what role you see Macau playing in the greater business area, Greater Bay Area. And somewhat provocatively, the questioner asks, does it have any comparative advantages other than gambling?
I only have one thing to add is that the capital control or the so-called KYC, right? My point is that once you have technology to have a proper KYC, then and also trace the flow, then it will help or give the confidence for Beijing to open up the capital control, which means something good. But I'm not sure this is good for the gambling.
The location is quite good, especially now that the bridge is there. And I think it's probably underused. It's changed completely the accessibility of Macau now. So I don't know how long it will take for, real estate prices to go up outside the gambling area, outside the tourist area, or around Macau, maybe not necessarily in Macau, but again, the development of infrastructure change accessibility and therefore the possibility of participating in a larger labor market.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that cluster around what you could call issues of human capital. And one focuses on the area's ability to attract specifically foreign talent. The other, somewhat related, though independent, talks about education and the fact that while the Greater Bay Area has some very good universities, it doesn't really have a Stanford or an MIT, and doesn't really have a Tsinghua or a Fudan either. How much of a issue is that for the area's development, particularly in the tech sector?
I'm not quite sure if you need to have an MIT in the Greater Bay Area for the Greater Bay Area to function at its best. So long as there is still a fluid labor market in which talents can go from Stanford and MIT to the Greater Bay Area and work there. Well, we don't need to look that far. Just look at Taiwan. Taiwan never had an MIT, but they had their own Silicon Valley. TSMC is the largest semiconductor foundry now, not because their university produced all the talents, but you have a lot of people who went overseas to study, and then they brought back the talent to China or to Taiwan. Now, I think back to the government again. The government needs to create conditions conducive for the return of these various trained professional overseas. Now, in the case of Hong Kong, I think it's a little bit trickier because depending on what you're training people for, our various institutions were very much a colonial product, and their mission was different. But then, Hong Kong people were more outward-looking. There were a lot more of us who went overseas for education before, and somehow the broadening of educational possibilities locally seem to have muffled that ever so slightly. So I hope that is not going to be a permanent issue, and that there will still be very much a global worldly orientation of our young people who can then experience life overseas, learn from experience elsewhere, and then bring it back to wherever they want to work.
I mean, at the moment, of course, and this is a peculiar moment, but at the moment there seems to be a net flow of highly trained talent away from Hong Kong in particular. I mean, not so much young talent, but if you look at withdrawals from the pension scheme and so forth, clearly a lot of highly skilled middle-aged people are going away. Is this a blip? Is this a problem to really worry about?
Well, it certainly is, because of this national security law, when that erases the difference, a jurisdictional difference. North of the border versus in Hong Kong, people are understandably anxious. But I think the more recent concerns have more been COVID related, when you're locked in your city and you cannot go anywhere else. And Hong Kong is in a way, because of COVID, trapped in the middle. There's neither pivoting towards mainland China, where you could move in and out of that jurisdiction freely, nor is it allowing its own to go overseas to frequent destinations of the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and all those places that the global citizens of Hong Kong used to frequent. So I think the restriction of movement because of COVID was very damaging, and that is only compounded by what happened before that in terms of legal issues.
That's why I hope that COVID will never happen again.
Well, there are lots of reasons to hope it will never happen again. But we are getting well into people's mornings in Hong Kong and into the night here in Chicago. I think we have plenty to chew on. So maybe we should leave it there, and I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Ken and Alain and Zhiguo and John. Thanks for the lively discussion. I learned a lot. I hope our audience did as well. We have a poll for tonight's program on Zoom, if you're on Zoom. And if you're watching on live on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your answers in the comments below those platforms. And while you complete the survey, I want to remind you that we have a program coming up next Thursday at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time. So please register for that. Our professor, Konstantin Sonin, from the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy will join us for our program next Thursday called War in Ukraine, a Grave Miscalculation. Don't miss that program. I think it'll be really interesting, and we'll probably have a couple additional programs on the war in Ukraine coming up. So make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and our new channel on LinkedIn, and the Yuen Campus website for more information about all of our Yuen Campus activities and events. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a wonderful day or evening wherever you may be.